Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 237, Fort Donelson Redux. Last time, we took a more extended look at an action in modern-day Oklahoma. This is definitely part of the war that not very many people know about, even if you are interested about the Civil War in general. So I think it was a good chance to maybe go back and look at a piece of the war that we bypassed the first time west of the Mississippi. This week, we return to redo a very important early engagement of the war. We need to talk a little more in depth about Fort Donelson. Before we do that, though, let's talk a little bit about Patreon content. And, of course, we have posted a little bit of a different episode for this month. We did a little bit of an analysis in terms of what kind of role you might want during the war, and of course did a little bit of a scoring system to kind of whittle that down, and talked a little bit about the pros and cons for different roles that you might have, of course. And so if that sounds like it would interest you, we've done some more type episodes, of course, where we've kind of come up with a scoring system and kind of analyzed things from there. If that sounds like it would interest you, of course, we've done, like I said, other type episodes like that. We have done movie reviews. We've done memoir reviews in the past, picture slideshows. Coming up here next Patreon episode for next month, we're actually going to be doing our first show or series review. We're going to be doing Manhunt, and that was an Apple series that I happened to watch, and we wasn't really planning on doing a review of that one, but unfortunately, I saw it and I couldn't unsee it, and so now we're actually going to be doing one. Pulled out my phone and started typing, so kind of left the station there. So we'll be releasing that one here shortly. So if any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description, and those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. So we've made a pretty good string of redoing our battles in the early part of the war. I think it's no surprise that we hit our stride when it came to larger engagements when we got into 1863 proper in the main narrative series. As such, though, I think we might have partially overlooked a major early battle in Fort Donelson. The significance has multiple points to it. For one, it is the first great victory of Ulysses S. Grant. In the same kind of way, we can consider Gaines's Mill to be important, as that engagement is Lee's first victory. Fort Donelson also holds something similar for his main protagonist. The legend that becomes Grant is also grown here with the unconditional surrender portion. The battle itself was not without its strange points, however. This is still an early engagement for both armies, so there are more mistakes and areas of mismanagement than I think we see in the latter stages for sure. While it is not a huge battle, the two forces are not insignificant, there being approximately 25,000 Federals and 17,000 Confederates. Casualty numbers would likewise not be insignificant, although they're overshadowed perhaps by Shiloh, which is coming in the spring. I think we often overlook Shiloh as well because it is a kind of an early battle, but Shiloh has a lot of kind of ripple effects, especially in the sub-theater of the war, especially if you take a look at, say, Confederate regiments. There's a lot of those units that become consolidated units after Shiloh because they sustain such heavy casualties at that battle. That's for the reason why we have a lot of first-hand accounts where they say that Shiloh is actually where they see the fiercest fighting. And one day, I kind of want to go back and redo a little bit of Shiloh for that reason, because I think we did a pretty good job of that battle in the narrative episodes, but I think it's worth maybe going back and taking a look once again at Shiloh and maybe revisiting, if not the battle as a whole, maybe picking a portion of the battle and really kind of maybe figuring out exactly what made it such a deadly battle, as opposed to why we have kind of like this focus on the Hornet's Nest and the Sunken Road portion of the battle, where we've kind of proven that that's not necessarily where a lot of the casualties are coming from. As we often sort of pondered back in the narrative episodes, Mill Springs, Kentucky becomes the beginning of the end for the Confederacy, and although this is sort of made in jest, it does represent the tenuous state the Confederacy is in. Albert Sidney Johnston will be subject of a future episode, but he does have a pretty crazy responsibility in holding down the entirety of the Confederate States in what we call the West. This is going to be a monster task, and although Johnston was considered to be a very capable general, this is going to be something that even Lee in his prime is going to have a tough time with. So in line with our Mill Springs discussions, you can really point to Forts Henry and Donelson as to what truly does begin to unravel the Confederate defense. They had for a time held a foothold in Kentucky, tried to remain with Tennessee in the hands of the South, and then also checked on Missouri, amongst other states. You could reasonably, even in the early stage, think that Johnston might have been better off just going straight to the offensive, but holding all the territory at a manpower disadvantage, and also a disadvantage in gunboats, is going to be a really tall task. As such, we see the fall of these two forts, and then the surrender of 13,000 or so defenders to be a pretty large setback. Without Donelson, very soon Nashville falls and Johnston is forced into Mississippi, where he's going to plan to strike that eventually leads to Shiloh, or at least PGT Beauregard is going to plan that attack. While I've thought it is important to talk about the battle itself, I think there are also many questions about the decisions of both sides that really underscore what we will eventually see as the main issues they face. As I have mentioned before, Grant will understand what it takes to win the war, and I think a lot of his early lessons he will pick up at this battle. So I hope to highlight that as we go along as well. But then I also want to highlight really why this battle is important, right? Other than the fact that it's just gaining of experience in the early portions, right? If we are going to have this kind of notion that Shiloh does become this kind of hinge point of the Confederacy kind of being undone in the sub-theater, right? No matter how you cut it, no matter how you slice it, you know, if you're saying that Bragg is the kind of the guy who is going to be the main culprit, which some people necessarily are going to point at him and some people don't. And I'm kind of on the fence about that myself, so you can obviously have your own opinion about him. And if you're saying that maybe Albert Sidney Johnston doesn't do necessarily a fantastic job of managing things up until that point, but you can also really understand that this is such a setback that you could really probably have used 13,000 men at Shiloh, right? Even if everything else being equal, say you do have to abandon these forts, there's a lot of things that could have gone essentially exactly the same way that they did, where the forts do still fall, but essentially the surrender of these 13,000 men is really the important piece that I think is the significant part for the Confederacy, for the South, and for Grant even, that makes this a very significant early engagement. And that might be something that's very simplistic to say, and you might say, well, duh. You know, obviously, it's not necessarily that Fort Donelson was like this impregnable fortress, right? And it's maybe the river traffic, like, yeah, you could probably point at that and say, yeah, okay, you know, rivers are important, right? And territory is important, and Nashville is also important. That's a big city, and there's manufacturing capability that the South loses, but it's the manpower, and we see that as the war progresses, and Grant sees that as the war progresses. He understands that the South cannot continue to have this manpower capability that the North has, and so that's where it lies. While these other things are also important, that's really the true importance. So as we have highlighted, Albert Sidney Johnston has a pretty difficult tasker, acting offensively and defensively at the same time, and he has a huge amount of space that he needs to operate in. In the early stages of the war, this problem is going to be compounded by the arrival of Leonidas Polk. Polk is going to take it on himself to move into Kentucky and occupy positions there. Kentucky, if you recall from our early episodes, had decided to initially be neutral, and violation of that neutrality is going to be a big mark against whichever side decided to do so. Polk is going to be negative to Johnson, not only in violating this neutrality, but it sort of is going to be opening up a new front that otherwise did not exist there. It may have been easier just to defend Tennessee, but with Polk's move, this made the territory that much larger. There is a military maxim that claims if you defend everywhere, then you defend nowhere. This would certainly be true, as Johnson would have to defend a line from Bowling Green, Kentucky, all the way to the Cumberland Gap, which is quite a long way. What might have been more effective would have been an offensive action, but as it was, the initiative was placed into the hands of the Union generals commanding in the region. Almost comically, once Polk had stepped foot in the Bluegrass State, Grant was in Paducah, and Robert Anderson, who is going to soon give way to William T. Sherman, will be moving into the northern part of the state as well. Johnson would need to make ready his troops just to hold on in a sense. He did not have a large amount of them, though, so the South would need to wage a propaganda campaign to make it seem like they had a large army at Bowling Green, something that's going to lead to Sherman's continued calls for reinforcements. For the North, continued preparations would be made for some kind of move into the Confederate interior. One great way to do this would be rivers. As such, the Confederates would start to make preparations along the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers. One such fort would be placed on questionable ground, Fort Henry on the Tennessee. With this, the 10th Tennessee would be the primary regiment in the area, made up of many Irish, commanded by a former mayor of Nashville, Randall McGavock. Adolph Hyman would attempt to build a fort on the opposite side of the river, as that was actually the better position, but progress on that is going to be slow. The Union are also going to realize the significance of these rivers, and they are going to start to put an emphasis on building up resources in order to capitalize. Early in the war, they would task Commander Rogers with the acquisition of vessels for a brown water navy. He would do so as there were many steamships sidelined as part of the war. 3 timber-clad vessels would come from this to establish early war dominance on part of this navy. James Eads of St. Louis was given a contract for ironclads to be created, which would also be added to this fleet. The timberclads were only reinforced with oak panels, so they were not quite so useful when it came to facing off against shore batteries. The city-class ironclads, or Pook's Turtles as they were called, after naval architect Samuel Pook, would be better suited to this task. Andrew Hull Foote would replace Rogers prior to the campaign for the forts, giving him operational control over what had very quickly become a formidable fleet, besting most anything the Confederates had in the vicinity at this time. Indeed, this shows the manpower advantage that the North would hold for the remainder of the war, in that the Confederates are just not going to be able to produce on the same level. They were able to control the rivers to the point where they had performed a recon on Fort Henry, which would be given to Lloyd Tillman to command, now there being a Fort Hyman on the opposite side of the river. In November of 1861, there would begin what we can classify as the opening or preliminary moves of the campaign. Really, we have 2 battles in which we have the first actions for 2 of the officers who will be with us for the majority of the war. Troops were being built up in and around Cairo, or Cairo as it was locally known. Grant would be joined by John McClernand and John Logan from Illinois. Additionally, we have the arrival of C.F. Smith. Remember that Charles Ferguson Smith will be considered to be a bright star, great things being expected of him, as he had been teaching at West Point. John C. Fremont will still be commanding in Missouri, shortly to be replaced by Henry Halleck. Fremont would order these initial operations for troops who were eager for action. Smith would command at Paducah and try to put pressure on Leonidas Polk at Columbus. Grant would steam down the river with several regiments and engage Confederates at Belmont. Grant's troops would see initial success, loot the Confederate camp, and then face a counterattack, while many had become intoxicated. Despite this setback, Grant would be able to extradite his command before there was a real disaster. Nathan Bedford Forrest, in the meantime, would arrive at Fort Donelson and begin operating in Kentucky. In December of 1861, we have the initial skirmish at Sacramento, Kentucky, which would start to spark up his legend. With these actions, we have a reset of the board, Halleck again taking over in late November, while Don Carlos Buell will take over for Sherman in Louisville. Both of these commanders would receive ponderous directives. For Buell, it would be to try to get at East Tennessee, Lincoln making liberation of this area a priority. Halleck was intended to be his support. Clear orders are not going to be received until Lincoln asked Halleck directly what he was going to do to help out Buell, maybe in an attempt to get at Bowling Green, Kentucky. In January of 1862, Halleck would order demonstrations from Grant and C.F. Smith as part of this cooperation. Smith would feint toward Dover, while also taking a look at Fort Henry. Grant would lead a column toward Columbus and Polk. Despite bad road and weather conditions, the columns would return important results. Fort Henry was still weak, and the Confederates showed no ability to counter these moves. This would be contrary to the reports that there were large troop numbers in the region. Johnson maybe could call on 30,000 men, whereas Buell would have 50,000 men in Louisville alone. Halleck would meet with Grant briefly, Grant trying to propose a move on Fort Henry to take it. Initially, Old Brains would dismiss the plan, but in reality, he had already thought it up himself. In the meantime, he had tried to replace Grant, seen as a loose cannon, having had the brash action at Belmont. But the decision to attack seemed to make sense, despite Grant writing that Halleck had considered it preposterous. On January 30th, there would be orders given to Grant to make preparations to assault and hold the work. Buell was a little miffed by this, as Halleck had told him he would be unable to support his operations until February. In some ways, he was correct, as the potential taking of Fort Henry and Donelson would be important to their joint operations. Now, I'm usually kind of hard on Henry Halleck, and to be fair, I think sometimes he deserves it. But we should actually point out that Don Carlos Buell, at this point in the war, I think we're kind of benefited by the fact that we know how things turn out, right? We know that Don Carlos Buell fails to really do a whole lot of anything, right? He has this battle at Perryville, and then that's kind of it, right? He kind of sort of sputters out, and then he eventually resigns from the army, before the war is even over. But at this point in the war, right, he is a good friend of George McClellan, and at this point, early on, when McClellan becomes the commander of all the Union forces, then it is a good position to be in, a friend of George McClellan. You have Buell, who is out here in Kentucky. Then you also have Burnside, who is on the coast. And these are two good friends of McClellan who are really benefiting from that. So if you are Halleck, who is not necessarily a friend of McClellan, then you could also see Buell as a potential rival and someone who I don't necessarily want this guy to do as well as me, right? And this is where kind of the infighting of these Union generals really shows itself. Halleck is the kind of guy that, and right, history is always sort of weird like that, where it always seems to me like Halleck is sort of this sniveling guy who's like, I don't want Grant to do really all that well because he's going to outshine me. I don't want Buell to do well because he's kind of this rival. But at the same time, it is actually sort of true, right? That it is kind of this complicated game of things that if Buell does well, then, McClellan is going to make McClellan look good too. So there is something to be said of that as well. So there is kind of like this complicated kind of web at play here that we should sort of point out. With Price chased out of Missouri and Samuel Curtis soon to land a decisive victory at Pea Ridge, and the Confederates lacking in improving any forts, this seemed to be a good call to begin offensive action. Grant would quickly assemble 15,000 men, timberclads and ironclads, for the job. Tillman would be given additional regiments, however, it would soon prove too little, too late. February 6th would mark the beginning of the assaults. Halleck would initially wish for a complete investment of the works, but this was not going to be realistic given that there were several routes for the defenders that they could use to escape. Grant had directed the landing of C.F. Smith's command to combine a land and naval assault on Fort Henry. The work at this time would be armed with 16 cannon, 11 directed at the river, including a 10-inch Columbiad, which would be a huge weapon that might be brought to bear against the Brownwater Navy. Ground troops would begin their approach, but due to continued weather conditions, the growing was going to be slow. McClernand's division would advance on the Fort Henry side of the river, Smith's division on the Fort Hyman side of the river. Ironclads Essex, Carondelet, Cincinnati, and St. Louis would lead the charge downriver. Timberclads Lexington, Conestoga, and Tyler behind. Andrew Hull Foote would be leading from the Cincinnati. Early in the morning, the Navy would begin with a bombardment from a couple thousand yards. For roughly an hour, the sides traded blows. The Essex would receive a disabling hit to the boiler, but 2 cannon would burst in Fort Henry, and the Columbiad would likewise become disabled. With water actually flooding Fort Henry, the battle was going to be over fairly quickly. Remember that the site of Fort Henry is underwater currently, so we have a pretty good idea of just how poorly the fort was positioned. Tillman had evacuated the fort of the infantry regiments, hoping to get them to Fort Donelson. It was only him and the artillerymen manning the guns. 2,600 additional defenders would be needed, and maybe thinking that they could hold out. He struck the colors in the afternoon, formally surrendering to the Navy, who famously rowed a boat into the work. Infantry would arrive shortly at the 2 forts, but really everything was finished. Foote would report, "The armored gunboats resisted effectually the shot of the enemy when striking the casemate. The Cincinnati flagship received 31 shot, the Essex 15, the St. Louis 7, and Carondelet 6, killing 1 and wounding 9. In the Cincinnati and killing 1, and the Essex, while the casualty in the latter from steam amounted to 28 in the number. Carondelet and St. Louis met with no casualties." In a weird way, it was just kind of matter of fact. I think there are some things that we did in the narrative which might seem sparse, but the build-up is actually far greater than the actual event itself, and Fort Henry is just one of those events. It speaks not only to lack of Southern resources, but also poor planning as well. Crucially, Tillman would also surrender himself with the artillery. This would rob the rebels of a key leader on the ground who was familiar with the territory. Hyman would be in charge until Pillow, and then John Floyd, former Secretary of War, would show up with his reinforcement at Fort Donelson. As it was, Johnson would withdraw to Nashville from Bowling Green in response to the fall of the fort. Many of his subordinates would wish for an aggressive show of force, which might have been accomplished. It is one of those things that sort of makes Johnson an enigma. He does not act aggressively at all, but instead continues to give the initiative to the enemy. In the case of Grant, he is someone who is going to jump at the chance to be aggressive and seize it. In a strange way, Fort Henry seals the fate of the Confederates in Kentucky, and also Fort Donelson. Kentucky, including the formidable defenses at Columbus, would have to be abandoned. If there could be a delay in action at Donelson, this was going to aid the rebels, but holding it is going to be out of the question. But also, if you know that there is going to be some sort of action at Fort Donelson, and you know that Grant only has 15,000 men, and you know you can hit him perhaps en route, there's all kinds of different things that you could set up if you're Johnson, if you're being aggressive, right? So it is kind of very odd that he does kind of sit back, and is this kind of decision paralysis, perhaps? That is certainly something that's on the table that I've seen in the past, where it's just too much, right? I think even if you have somebody who's particularly good at making decisions and might be very capable and confident in certain situations, if you just have too much on their plate, if you just have too much that's being thrown at them, and this could be a case where Albert Sidney Johnson just can't really react because there's just so much that he has to deal with. Another fallout of the loss of Fort Henry would be the opening of the river to the Union Navy. 3 ships would steam down and wreak havoc as far as Florence, Alabama. The Confederate attempt to convert the steamer Eastport into an ironclad is going to be thwarted. Supplies and transports chased and captured. In the meantime, both armies would scramble. Grant would wish to remain on the offensive and press on Fort Donelson. Halleck would do a good job in supporting this decision, sending them reinforcements, as it was surmised he would need them, should the Confederates try to rally on his target. Charles Cruft would arrive from Buell, who also decided to support the venture to the best of his ability, as had been requested of him by George B. McClellan. John Thayer arrived to command another brigade, there being a 3rd division under Lew Wallace, created for Grant's growing army. It had been possible to remain where he was, as more were on the way. However, Grant again does not wish to relinquish the initiative. He would issue orders to advance on February 12th toward Donelson. Confederate command, while this is going on, would become sort of a mess. Johnson had withdrawn into Tennessee, as we mentioned, and wanted to establish a new line. Command at the fort, as there had been a vacuum left behind by the capture of Tillman, is going to fall to Simon Bolivar Buckner. Gideon Pellow would then be tabbed to arrive at the fort, taking over for Buckner. John Floyd is going to arrive, and he's actually going to outrank him. So then Floyd is going to take over, and Floyd is going to want to actually establish a defensive position at Cumberland City, which is further downriver from Dover. Pellow would respond from reports from engineers that the works were actually pretty well done, and could in fact repulse an assault by land and potentially water. He was not willing to give up just yet. Floyd would eventually be ordered to Donelson, but there was confusion on the part of Albert Sidney Johnson, who did not think that the troops were moving to Cumberland City as opposed to making a more determined stand. Part of the problem, and we can chalk this up to the responsibility that Johnson has in terms of the territory, is that he's unable to understand the situation on the ground and is leaving this up to subordinate officers to make the call. You see, Johnson had never been there himself. He did have 4 officers, Bushrod Johnson, Buckner, Pellow, and Floyd. They're on the ground and seemingly in a good position. The water batteries were manned by some 300 men, a much better garrison than Fort Henry, and the 50 or so artillerymen there. Nathan Bedford Forrest was also doing a good work in picketing the approaches of Grant and his army and giving reliable intel on the movements. So that's another thing that we can probably say about Albert Sidney Johnson, and we'll again talk about this probably more in depth at a future episode, but he is going to put a lot of trust into these guys that are on the ground. And you could probably also very much kind of very logically think that he has a point. He's never been there. He's never actually seen Fort Donelson. It's really just a point on a map, right? It's very, in our modern mind, we can see and say, hey, well, this is a photograph. We have a lot of resources that we can say, like, hey, we can understand what this looks like. Well, he doesn't have any of that, right? He's just looking at a map. So he has 4 guys that he should be relied upon because they're officers, and he's trusting them to make the right decision. And unfortunately for him, if I'm looking at these 4 names on this list, you probably have, in my opinion at least, and maybe you can have your own opinion about these guys, but I have 1.5 individuals that I would actually trust in terms of a Civil War field army. I have 1.5 guys that I would trust out of these 4, right? So, and I'll let you guess as to who that is. So, unfortunately, they're facing an individual who is taking the right amount of necessary risk. We talk about that a lot. When you have situations that are developing and reacting to that development as they happen on the ground, taking the necessary risk, seizing the initiative, right? It's something that's very big. That's something Robert E. Lee is very famous for, right? He wants to remain on the initiative. And that's something that Grant does very well in this campaign especially. And he'll continue to try to do throughout his tenure when he's commanding. And unfortunately, that is something that these guys are going to be kind of outclassed by. McClellan's division would begin its approach in earnest on the 12th as ordered. The USS Carondelet would in the meantime steam to reconnoiter on the water. The vessel would lob a few shells at the defenses while Forrest's cavalry would skirmish with their northern counterparts. In fact, some of Forrest's men were armed with Maynard breech-loading weapons, so they were able to put a lively fire on the Yankees. February 12th would end, though, with both armies attempting to get into position. This work would continue on the 13th, both lines extending. Reportedly, Forrest would engage some of his troopers with Burge's sharpshooters during this time. The USS Carondelet would return, but this time the works would score a hit, causing some casualties and damage. After repairs, they would work to get back into position, continuing to shell the enemy works. C.F. Smith's division would attempt to maneuver, first with the 45th Indiana, but they would make contact with Kentucky troops of the Orphan Brigade, bringing on some general fighting. Of course, they would not be known as the Orphan Brigade just yet, but that will be the entity that will become known as the Orphan Brigade. One Iowa soldier in C.F. Smith's command would write, "The air seemed literally full of flying bullets. They screamed through the air above our heads and plowed through our ranks. We returned fire as best we could, but all the advantage was back with the rebels. They were behind breastworks, and we were literally exposed, while we were in plain view." McClernand, too, would have a reconnaissance that was going to run into McGavock and his 10th Tennessee, which would put a lively firefight of their own with the advancing Federals. As night fell on the 13th, there would be snow, temperatures dropping to 12 degrees. February 14th would see the decisions for both sides begin to evolve. For the Union forces, Grant decided to move Lew Wallace and the newly arrived divisions into the siege. They would plug a gap between C.F. Smith and McClernand. You see Smith on the left flank, pressing Buckner, while McClernand was on the right, watching the Dover Road, but the line was stretched fairly thin. With Wallace arriving in the field, this is going to free up John MacArthur and his brigade to move to the right flank, thus extending the Union line. For the Confederates, they had decided that on the 14th they were going to attempt to break out, but it's going to be called off by Gideon Pillow. Pillow had thought that his movements were detected, angering John Floyd, who was ready to get out of Fort Donelson. William Baldwin's Mississippi and Tennessee regiments were in position and ready to jump off on the flank before there was a change in decision, something that was puzzling at the time, even for the officers involved. In the meantime, the Navy would attempt to bombard the work. A decision would need to be made in terms of how exactly to go about that. There could be a longer range battle, as the Carondelet had just undergone, but it would take time. Engaging in closer range opened the Navy with risk of damage and casualties, but it had just worked at Fort Henry, so maybe it's going to work again. Naval reinforcements, including mortar vessels, were on the way, so Foote had recommended to wait. But time is ticking away. You see, any Confederate response might be coming if Albert Sidney Johnston had enough men to react, and thus pressure was put on successful, decisive assault. It would not go the way Foote had planned, as the current of the river would make it difficult to maneuver. The guns on the river approach would have a good firing alley too, the 32-pounders doing most of the work. We have an account from Commander Walk. Soon, a 128-pounder struck our anchor, smashing it into flying bolts, and bounded over the vessel, taking away part of our smokestack. Another shot took away the remaining boat davits, and the boat with them. And still they came, harder and faster, taking flagstaff, smokestacks, and tearing off the side armor as lightning tears bark from a tree. The warning words, "Look out, down," were again soon heard. Down went the gunner and his men, as the whizzing shot glanced on the gun, taking off the gunner's cap, and the heads of two of the young men who trusted to luck, and the defiance of the order were standing up or passing behind him. This shot killed another man also, who was at the last gun of the starboard side, and disabled the gun. It came in with a hissy sound, 3 sharp spats, and a heavy bang told the sad fate of 3 brave comrades. Louisville and St. Louis both were disabled in the fight, Foote being wounded in the action. Each of the gunboats, in fact, sustained some kind of damage with mounting casualties. None of the Confederate guns were disabled in the fight. In the early hours of February 15th, it was decided another breakout attempt would be launched. It would be an understandable choice for the rebels, as Lew Wallace's arrival was a good case-in-point example that more Yankees were on the way, and that eventually there was a possibility of completely being cut off. The problem with this move was in its disorganization and the understanding of what was to happen. Generally speaking, Pellow would lead an attack on the Union right, open up the road to escape to Nashville, Buckner would form a rear guard, and the Confederates would escape. But while Buckner ordered his men to carry knapsacks, Pellow would believe there would be time to retrieve supplies and then continue once the road was open. But more importantly, he thought the object of the 15th would be to defeat Grant, not remove him from the avenue of escape. Pretty amazingly, though, the assault on the morning of the 15th is going to be a pretty resounding success. Colonel Joseph Drake and Gabriel Wharton would form part of the attacking column, with Baldwin's split command also joining in. MacArthur had occupied a place called Dudley's Hill, where would be hit with these troops without really being able to form a defense. MacArthur only recently arrived with little directive. Their replacement, though, had been enough to disrupt the rebel attack, and their stubborn defense, despite some 27% casualties, would blunt what otherwise might have been an even more successful move. MacArthur would run into Richard Ogilvy's command, the two brigades trying to stem the rebel onslaught. McClernand would desperately call on Grant for assistance, but Grant had gone to confer with the Navy as Foote was on crutches and was not able to go to Grant's headquarters. Lew Wallace would initially buck at the idea of sending help, as Grant had essentially told everyone to stay put, Smith flat out refusing. For all the blame that Grant throws on Wallace at Shiloh, Wallace would do well in saving Grant's army on the 15th by sending Cruft's brigade to the rescue. Eventually, they would sit on the flank of William Wallace, preventing him from being overrun, allowing for MacArthur and Oglesby to withdraw, both running low on ammunition. Buckner's command had been intended for an attack in the center, but was delayed due to some confusion with the replacing units for their spot on the line. He would have a large brigade under John Brown ready to go, and the 2nd Kentucky leading it, which is a more experienced regiment. Buckner would hold until he had all his units ready to go in, as opposed to throwing them in piecemeal. They would jump off and attack toward a battery commanded by Edward McAllister. This was intended to take out William Wallace's brigade, but the Union artillery would push back this move. Wallace, though, was having to feed in his men into the developing situation on the right. His troops relieved the 31st Illinois under Logan, who had been fighting all morning, Logan being wounded in this action and carried from the field. Buckner would renew his efforts and receive help from Forrest and his cavalry. Forrest would make an assault on McAllister's guns, capturing them in the process. Thus, by outflanking their enemy, the Confederates would finally remove Wallace from the Wynn's Ferry Road, a key to their escape. Lew Wallace had formed up Thayer's brigade and repulsed continued rebel efforts along the road, finally ending the rolling of the Federal line. It was here where we have the fateful decision of the battle. Gideon Pellow would remove his troops back into Fort Donelson to resupply and rearm. Not only would he do this, though he'd also inform Buckner that he too was to get back into the fort. Fighting had been going on for some 7 hours, but to simply give up all the ground gain was a puzzling decision. It had been Pellow's opinion, once again, that the objective would be to try to destroy Grant's army and keep the fort perhaps, so maybe this was something to do with it. Floyd would become exasperated, though, exclaiming, "My God, Pellow, what have you been fighting all morning for?" Floyd might have ordered Buckner to remain, and maybe he would have been able to open up their way to Nashville, or at least try to regain some of the ground, but he chose to keep Buckner moving back to consolidate. Ulysses Grant would realize what the fighting had been for. He knows Buckner's men and their equipment. Reforming his shattered ranks, he would call on C.F. Smith to assault Fort Donelson, who exclaimed that he would do it. The 2nd Iowa, under James Tuttle, would be tasked with leading this effort, despite being a recent arrival to the field. Facing them would be the 30th Tennessee, who now had to cover the same amount of space recently occupied by Buckner's 3,500-man division. They would hold their own for a time, inflicting 30% casualties on the Hawkeyes, before the weight of C.F. Smith's attack would force them to withdraw. The charge was considered to be quite the valiant effort by all those involved. We have an account from one of the participants. The left wing was commanded by Colonel Tuttle. Up the hill we pushed. "Steady, boy," shouted the colonel. We had scarcely emerged from the woods when the devils opened up on us. The first volley sounded like a crash of thunder, and the balls flew round us like hail, but not a waver could be seen in our lines. We're now on the open ground, right at the breastworks. "Right over, boys," said the colonel. The boys gave a yell, and they did go over. Buckner's arrival back into Fort Donelson would dissuade any continued action. Lew Wallace, in the meantime, had moved his troops out as well, clearing any Confederates outside their lines. The 15th would end with both sides relatively in the same spot that they had been in the morning. So the decision would fall yet again on Floyd to figure out what to do. He would ponder the next course of action, asking Forrest to maybe probe for a way out for the army. Forrest would find a way to maybe escape, but fording a creek in icy conditions would be viewed as detrimental to the army. As it was, Forrest, his cavalry, and anyone else who would come with him would indeed escape. The fiery cavalry officer would write that for some 2 hours they crossed the creek, drawing no fire from the Federals, an example of how easy it might have been to save part of the army. In fact, the Union forces were most likely not in a position to stop the rebels in their flight to Nashville. But Floyd would relinquish command to Pillow, who would then relinquish command to Buckner for a potential surrender while both of those commanders escaped. Floyd might have also waited for transports to return to the fort, had he been able to withstand an attack that would have surely come from Grant the next morning. But famously, Grant would call for an unconditional surrender of his pre-war friend Buckner, the rebels having to surrender some 11,500 men. This would see Grant's star rise, drawing ire from Henry Halleck, the rivalry brewing there. A description of the Confederates would be given. Crowds of Confederates, very few of whom were in uniform, and who were unable to find shelter, stood in groups in the rain, under guard of our men. A more pitiable collection of human beings was probably never seen. Dejected and exhausted, hungry, wet, and cold, they huddled together, in the mud and rain, waiting for the rolls to be made and rations issued. Very few had blankets or overcoats, some were without hats, their heads and shoulders wrapped in shawls and quilts as protection against the rain. This is also a pretty good idea of a couple things, right? Of just kind of the equipment disparity that the Confederates have here in this battle. There's a lot of accounts of how a lot of them are armed with like shotguns, right? They don't have kind of the proper equipment, and yet really the attack that they have on the 15th is something that almost works. Had there been a very clear directive in terms of what was to happen once the roads were opened up, it could have very well have been this flank attack happens, and then the army is able to extradite itself from Fort Donelson, then they're marching on to Nashville, and then what happens after that, right? Is Grant able to pursue? Is there any kind of follow-up after that? More than likely, maybe not, right? You never know what could happen in that scenario. But, if assuming that they're getting to reinforcements under Albert Sidney Johnston, you're probably more than likely not having any kind of follow-up there once Fort Donelson is abandoned. And then, what happens, right? You don't really have unconditional surrender Grant. And, is his star as bright? Does he eventually get to where he gets to? I don't know. It's kind of an interesting scenario of what could have happened. And it very easily could have, right? It's kind of like one of those things where maybe we don't necessarily think about Fort Donelson in that light, where it's kind of like other battles where we have situations that are what ifs, right? And, if you know me, if you listened to me before, I do like my what ifs. But this one really is, it's one of those things where it's almost like you get to the goal line and then you just drop the football, right? That's almost what it seems like. It's like there isn't like a different play that could have been run to score a touchdown here, right? That's not what we're talking about where we talk about with these other scenarios. It's literally we got to the goal line and you just dropped the football. All you had to do was just take one more step and then you're there. So it's a little bit of a different scenario, I think, with Fort Donelson. Albert Sidney Johnston would have to withdraw deeper into the south as a result of the loss not only of the forts, but of this manpower as well. Nashville would soon be placed into federal hands and will be headlong on the path leading to Shiloh. 2,600 Federals would become casualties compared to 1,400 Confederates, minus the large number of surrenders. This would be an important proving ground for both sides, especially the Union troops who would learn the campaign experience that will lead to Vicksburg, but also valuable battlefield experience as well. While Mill Springs might have been the beginning of the end, there's a good argument to be made. It all begins at Fort Henry and Donelson as well, leading us to having revisited here today. And so we will go ahead and call it a day here. Hopefully we now have a bigger picture view of this 1862 battle. At the very least, we kind of put it all together in one episode. I know we kind of strung it out in multiple episodes in the narrative, so if it's all in one episode here, perhaps it is a little bit easier to follow. Next week, we start to look at Units of the War, a new series that we're going to be doing, and we begin in a strange place, odd place to start, but we'll begin with the 1st Alabama U.S. Cavalry. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Post in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback is always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns, the email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.